Hi, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining this evening. The focus of our conversation is a new book by the Honorable Robert Conrad, John Fisher, and Thomas More, Keeping Their Souls While Losing Their Heads. Quite a provocative title, which we will delve into. We'll be discussing these two men's faith, conscience, and courage of these great saints, the parallels between their lives and the lessons they have to offer us today. Today's event is made possible by the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. The IHE is one of the nation's leading institutes committed to identifying the conditions conducive to human flourishing from an interdisciplinary perspective, bringing scholars from across the university, the country, and the world to think about these questions. At the outset, I also want to give special thanks to the co-sponsors of this webcast, the Catholic Information Center in Washington, D.C., the Center for Law and Human Person, and the Center for the Constitution and the Catholic Intellectual Tradition. I also want to give special thanks to the director, the executive director of the IHE, Russ Hittinger, the managing director, Stephen Higgins, and the rest of the team for organizing this event. Before we begin, I have a brief housekeeping item. If you would like to ask a question, and we welcome questions, I know that Judge Conrad would love to hear your thoughts about these two great saints. Please submit the question at any time through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will answer as many questions as time permits during the last portion of this podcast, approximately beginning at 4:45. And let me introduce myself. My name is Bill Saunders. I am the director of the program in human rights at the Institute for Human Ecology, which includes the MA in human rights. I'm also a human rights lawyer and the director of the Center for Human Rights at the Catholic University of America, as well as co-director of the Center for Religious Liberty at the Columbus School of Law. I'm very pleased to be joined this afternoon by the Honorable Robert Conrad. Judge Conrad's a former senior judge in the U.S. District Court for the Western District of North Carolina, and currently is the director of the administrative office of the U.S. Courts, which is headquartered here in Washington, D.C. He's also an ex-federal prosecutor, a former ACC basketball player, father, grandfather, coach, mentor, teacher, and amateur historian. In 2017, he was nominated by President Bush, George W. Bush, to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. In his book, John Fisher and Thomas More, which we're going to talk about, Keeping Their Souls While Losing Their Heads, he examines these two saints with a trial lawyer's love for advocacy and detail. Today's event promises to be an intriguing discussion. Judge Conrad and I have been friends for many years. We both share a passion for both of these two saints. So welcome, Judge Conrad.
Bill, it's great to be with you and participating in this podcast, knowing the many intriguing and wonderful conversations I've had with you in the past. I anticipate a really enjoyable hour.
Let me show everybody so you can see it. Here's the book with the two saints on the cover. I imagine most people listening have heard of these saints, or they wouldn't be listening, but perhaps there's some who haven't. So I want to spend just a little bit of time just sketching who these two people are. Again, probably everybody's heard of Thomas More, including non-Catholics and There was a famous movie about his life. They may not have heard of John Fisher, but Judge Conrad, if you would kind of give the listener a little bit of the biography of these two saints.
Sure. At the beginning of the 16th century, both men were coming into their careers, very different careers. Thomas More was a young lawyer who was also a scholar, and he was debating between the academic life, the monastic life, or possibly a life in public service, and dealing with the vocational implications of all three of those things. John Fisher was taking a different course. He became a priest in England at a very young age, had to get a dispensation to become a priest because he was so young. He then became a chaplain to the royal court and was educated at Cambridge, and ultimately became a fellow at Cambridge, later chancellor of Cambridge, and he would die as the lifetime chancellor of Cambridge University. So you had a father, then bishop, ultimately Cardinal Fisher, pursuing a life in the priesthood, and a magnificent lawyer in Thomas More, who became the King's Lord Chancellor.
Yeah, as two lawyers, Judge Conrad and I, really appreciate Thomas More. For me, well, I don't want to tell what I know about him. I want you to tell the listener. But so what tell us, again, I think people have a sense of what happened with More, although we'll come back to that. But tell them what happened to Fisher. And I just want to say, I do want to point out for anybody listening, it's an incredible thing that he was it called permanent or whatever, chancellor of Cambridge University. I mean, what a almost mind-blowing honor that is. And I know many people listening will be intellectuals or, have graduate degrees or be interested in that kind of life. He was a very learned man.
I was attracted to both these men for different reasons. Thomas More would be the role model for a young lawyer starting out in practice, juggling the responsibilities of family life and excellence in the legal profession, as well as pursuing his faith life in a very serious way. And for the busy 21st century professional, More is an incredible role model, being excellent in all three of those areas: the family life, the professional life, the spiritual life. John Fisher, a very completely different man, where More was an extrovert, Fisher was an introvert, where More pursued a very public life and was often the life of the party wherever he was. Fisher was much more the academic, rigorous pursuit of the Greek language, the Latin language, professor at Cambridge, and also his brilliance was matched by his holiness. And so he was aesthetic, he was principled, he had chosen a life outside the public spotlight, but events of the day brought him into the public spotlight and into the crosshairs, ultimately, of Henry VIII.
There's so many ways you can go with Fisher. One thing I think is also worth just people who don't know it, he was the confessor to Henry's mother, right?
Yes.
So he was well known to the king, and Well, Bob, I'm going to get more into specifics of the book, but in a minute. But why don't you tell us what brought these two men together in London, along with the Carthusians under the reign of Henry VIII?
Sure, a little historical background. Henry the Seventh was King of England, and he and King Ferdinand of Spain decided it would be a good idea for both their families if they married off their young children. And so at the turn of the century, Arthur, Henry the Seventh's oldest son, and Catherine of Aragon, King Ferdinand's daughter, were betrothed at the age of, I think, 3 and 4. And then a decade goes by, and Catherine finally comes to England and meets, and within a month marries the 15-year-old Arthur. Sadly, Arthur was sickly and would die within a couple of months of the marriage. And Catherine would maintain for the rest of her life that the marriage had never been consummated. This is a very important fact because when Henry VIII succeeded his father, Henry VII, as King of England, the first thing he did was to marry his brother's former wife, Catherine of Aragon. And they lived together in relative harmony for another 20 years. But over that time period, Henry became very concerned that he had not produced a male heir with Catherine. And he also was infatuated by her maid, Anne Boleyn. And so he started to look for ways out of the marriage and into a new relationship with Anne Boleyn. And one of the things he came up with was a Leviticus prohibition of marrying your brother's spouse. And he thought, and he proclaimed that his marriage to Catherine was sinful, and therefore God was punishing him for that sinful relationship. Well, they had sought and obtained a papal permission to marry, and because the marriage had never been consummated, that prohibition was not valid. But it was a way for Henry to get out of the marriage and into a new relationship with Anne Boleyn. And so he pressured the Pope to grant an annulment for that purpose. And he also demanded of the English nobility and priests that they agree with him. And so in this story, in 1629, Henry had arranged for there to be a fact-finding hearing called a legate hearing in England, where 2 cardinals would preside over the matter. And the issue was whether the marriage was proper. Henry claimed in the hearing to have had the consent of every bishop in the realm. And he didn't have the kind of courtroom electronic presentation of evidence that lawyers today have. But he had in his hand a fistful of affidavits. And he claimed that every bishop in the realm had signed an affidavit saying he was theologically correct in his position. Bishop Fisher was there as Catherine's counsel. And when Henry made this declaration that every bishop agreed with him, Fisher stood up and said, "No, sir, not I. You have not my consent thereto." This stunned the king, and he turned on the archbishop, and he said to him, "Didn't you promise me that every bishop in the realm had signed these affidavits?" And the archbishop agreed with the king. And Fisher turned to the archbishop, basically accusing him of perjury, and said to him, Nothing could be further from the truth. Signing an affidavit such as that would be against my conscience. And so long before, or shortly before Thomas More and the king got crosswise, Fisher, in this amazing stand on conscience, puts himself squarely in crosshairs of the king.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure people listening think about it's hard to imagine, but how much power the king had. It's, I mean, more than we can imagine. I think almost unlimited power, and to say that is like a it's almost like a death sentence on yourself.
As brilliant as Fisher was, I'm sure he knew that. And he made matters worse because he then compared King Henry VIII to King Herod of biblical days, and put himself in the power and the authority of John the Baptist in the spirit of Elijah. And he confronted the king and the king's attorneys with the reality of the truth of the validity of the marriage, the permanence of marriage, and presented to the king an opportunity to save his soul and not to commit this egregious crime. Well, you can imagine how enraged the king became with such a comparison. And from that day forward, John Fisher's days were numbered.
Yeah, and now Fisher knew More, right?
Yes, they were about 10 years apart, but they were part of a group called the New Humanists, who were interested in the new learning, English coming out of England coming out of the Middle Ages, and pursuing knowledge at Cambridge and Oxford. And this group of people were very excited about the flourishing of the printing press was in the course of being invented, and travel between England and Italy and other countries. There was this new excitement for learning, and Fisher and More were part of that, as was Erasmus and others. And they knew each other through their academic pursuits. More referred to Fisher as the most brilliant man in the English Isles, and Fisher had a very deep respect for the younger More, and that friendship would grow as they were imprisoned in the Tower together. And so one of the fascinating things about these two men, and you mentioned the Carthusian monks, is the vocational aspect of this. Each of them were very different from each other personality-wise, and very different in their vocational pursuits. And there's a third group of people, these Carthusian monks, who had dedicated their lives to work and prayer, had no interest in the public disputes of the day, and were dragged into this controversy by the king's demand that everybody in the realm sign an oath acknowledging his position as head of the church in England. Well, that would have been against their monastic vow, and they couldn't do it. It would have been against Fisher and More's conscience, and they couldn't do it. So alone among all the people in England, these three groups of people, Thomas More, John Fisher, and the Carthusian monks, resisted the king. And they all wound up, although they had chosen completely different careers, they all wound up together temporally in the Tower of London, awaiting execution by a very vindictive king.
And they knew, they were aware that the others were there, right?
It was really interesting. The first to be executed were the Carthusian monks, and King Henry purposefully had them paraded in front of Thomas More's cell window, so he would see what would happen to traitors who would not sign the oath the king wanted him to sign. And More, seeing those monks, says to his daughter Meg, "Look, Meg, these monks going to their execution, happy as a bridegroom to their wedding feast." It was a profound, it had the exact opposite effect intended by Henry VIII. Fisher, when he would be executed, just a few weeks later, would tell his servant that that Fisher should be dressed in his finest clothes because he was going to his wedding feast. And then, of course, More dies with the famous saying, "I die the king's good servant and God's first." These men saw the eternal reality of the consequences of the choices they made in life. And they had a choice between continuing with their earthly success and prosperity or choosing a path to martyrdom where they would live eternally with the King of Kings. And if they were right, they live more splendidly today than King Henry VIII or any other king this world has ever known. Theirs was a level of certainty that is profoundly admiring.
So Thomas More, of course, I don't want to jump completely over him. Bob, you know, the Lord Chancellor of England, do you want to say anything more about him right now?
I would. An intriguing thing about his vocational choice is, unlike some of his friends, he left the academy to become a public servant, and he rose to the level of the Lord Chancellor, the number 2 person in the realm of England. He had concerns about taking that position because he knew that he and the king thought differently about what was called the king's great matter, the divorce. And so he said, he expressed his reservations to the king. And the king, in naming him Lord Chancellor, said to Thomas More, "On this my great matter, you should look first to God, and after God to me." And it was upon that agreement that Thomas More became Lord Chancellor. And I think when he dies, being executed by his friend Henry VIII, and he says, "I die the king's good servant and God's first," he's reminding the king of the agreement they had when he became Lord Chancellor. And then he is sending he is witnessing to his faith, both to his family and to his contemporaries, but also to the world that would come after him, that one can be a good public servant and God's servant first. And it's an extraordinary witness to us in the 21st century of what our priorities should be, and the ability for a faithful Christian to be a good public servant, as long as you know what your priorities are.
Yeah, you know, sometimes, you know, like you said, these 3 men and groups of men, the Carthusians and More and Fisher, you know, More, Lord Chancellor, the Carthusians, a religious order that's not involved, so they're in public life, so they're just kind of completely different in their lives. More in the middle of it, and then Fisher, the bishop, who is part of a college of bishops, but they all had to come to the point over their religious faith and their conscience. So, Bob, I know that conscience is an important part of this, and it's important in your book. And I'll take you to a part, you know, to something later in the book, but I don't know if you want to say any more about the conscience aspect, because like you said, all of these people could have avoided being killed. They just would have had to violate the truth, what they knew to be the truth.
You know, several hundred years later, another great English saint would come along, John Henry Newman. And conscience was as important to Newman as it was to Fisher and Moore. And in fact, Newman looked to Moore as one of the great saints of the church. And Newman had a great line that if you spare me, I'd like to read it. Out of my book when he's talking about this notion of vocation, that we serve God in different capacities, but we're all part of his plan. Newman says this: God has created me to do him some definite service. He has committed some work to me which he has not committed to another. I have my mission. I may never know it in this life, but I shall be told it in the next. Somehow, I am necessary for his purposes, as necessary in my place as an archangel in his. If indeed I fail, he can raise another, as he could make the stones children of Abraham. Yet I have a part in this great work. And that resonates with me, especially in application to Fisher Moore and the Carthusian monks. They had no idea when they go down their career paths that God would use them in the way he did. And he used a narcissistic, power-hungry king, lustful king. He used that person to draw these men out of their chosen vocations in ways they never predicted, but were fully intended by God. And as they followed their conscience, doing the right thing for the right reason, their witness to their faith in God and their belief in the eternal life is now 500 years strong. And it's just a fascinating thing to me that we choose our career paths, pursuing excellence in whatever field that is, not knowing how and in which ways God will use us to his own glory. And it just leaps off the pages of these men's lives that's exactly what God did with them. He led them to the scaffold. They lived wonderful lives of devotion and discipline, and then gave their life for a greater purpose to the glory of God. It's just inspiring these hundreds of years later.
Yeah, I mean, this book is inspiring for that reason, because it gives us two fantastic models. I mean, I'm very struck every time I hear about it, about how peaceful, or maybe even more so, joyfully they went to their deaths.
Yeah, I love that aspect of it. You know, when Fisher was told he was about to be executed in 4 hours, he thanked his guard and then went back to sleep. He had lived such a life of virtue that he was peaceful at the end. When Moore hit the scaffold, he joked with his executioner. He told the executioner, "Be careful of my beard. It has not committed treason against the king." And then he told the executioner that if he would help him up the stairs to the scaffold, he would see his own way down. But then he said to the executioner, "Be not afraid to do your task, for you send me to God." And so this is the ultimate reality underscoring the bravery of these men, that what looks like to us is bravery is to them just obedience. And they were obedient to the end. And certainly that's my prayer for all of us who want to follow in their footsteps in some way.
You know, one thing again, I want to talk about literally what's in the book, so the people who your future buyers of the book will know what's here. And one of the things that's good, really good about it is you have appendices with different prayers and things, including brief biography or timeline of these two saints, but or you call it resume. But I think that, you know, what I'm thinking about, Bob, as we're talking about is we're in Lent, and Lent is you know, a time of self-examination and prayer and fasting and almsgiving in preparation, you know, for Easter. And I think that this book can be tremendously helpful to people's devotion during Easter. And you have a novena to Moore and Fisher, which is a 9-day prayer cycle. So I thought maybe, well, you know, maybe we would just, I would just say a word about that, and you can, of course, I'll just set this novena is 9 days, and on each of the days you have a different, I suppose, virtue, truth. Well, not virtue, a different thing to be prayed about, because you got truth, then vanity, heaven, detachment, pursuit of truth, Christ's passion, fortitude, and love. So it just struck me when I was looking at this novena that it would be very helpful to somebody to again pray this during Lent, to make it part of their Lenten devotions. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's been helpful to me. The whole notion of novena, I think, requires an extended level of discipline and consistency, things that are often badly missing in my approach to life. And so in my writing of this book, it was my hope that I would communicate to my audience, and I largely had my children and my law clerks and interns in mind, and my adult children, law clerks and interns in mind as I worked through this book. And it was my hope that I could show the character of these two men in a way that they would know who their father or their judge or their friend, the kind of person he aspired to be like. And in no way do I think I come anywhere close in terms of either intellectual brilliance or spiritual holiness to either of these two men. But I thought to myself, if I wanted to try to become more like that, what are some ways that I could do it? And so the thought of writing a novena, of having 9 days of engagement with them was one way. And then there's some prayers of both Fisher and Moore in the appendix, that if someone wanted to, you know, John the Baptist is described as coming in the spirit and power of Elijah, you know, and so the question I ask myself is, how can I live in the spirit and power of John Fisher and Thomas Moore? And so that's the idea of the appendix. And then because I had young people in mind, I just thought I would do a resume like a judge might receive from a law student who's hoping to be a clerk someday. And when you put down the achievements of these men in their lives, you all of a sudden you're aware of how much they gave up in faithful obedience to their conscience. And then the remarkable thing to me is how willing they were to give all that up to follow their conscience. And so there's an interesting dichotomy between the Thomas More that is just portrayed brilliantly by Robert Bolt in A Man for All Seasons, and one of the epic books of my life, turning point in my life, was reading Bolt's play, A Man for All Seasons. But Bolt, in his introduction, describes More as this hero of selfhood, this person of adamantine self-control, kind of the modern man. And I came to such a different understanding of More's stand on conscience as I read more and more about Thomas More and John Fisher. It seemed to me that their conscience came out of their study of the church fathers and the scriptures. And they weren't so much self-confident as they were Christ confident. Their confidence came not because they were brave enough to stand alone in an England that everybody else went with the king. Their confidence came from knowing that they stood in a 2,000-year tradition of faithfulness to Christ. And they weren't alone. They were surrounded by a crowd of witnesses, and they almost couldn't do anything but follow their conscience. And so that kind of understanding of who they are because of what they believe really resonated with me, and trying to do an appendix where I could capture some of that in my own life and offer it to others who might read it. Sort of made that a little different part of the book than maybe I originally started out to write.
Yeah, well, I think it's great because, like with Thomas More, you have the resume, and then you realize what he was able to do to give that up. And then you have in the appendix his prayer on detachment, that's a powerful prayer, because obviously we're all meant to be detached from the things of this world in preparation for the great things of, we love the things of this world, but we'd be able to give them up. Right, Bob? That's why, to me, it illustrates what this great man who had all this in the resume that you chronicle was able to give up, because it was his vocation to be a saint, I guess. Some spiritual directors say we're all destined to, that's our vocation, Bob. I don't know. It was his. I don't know if it's mine, but maybe he can help show people like me the way to get there.
I don't know that any of us are called to the big martyrdom of Fisher and More, but I think all of us are called to little martyrdoms, denials of things in this world because of our belief in the next. And one of the characteristics of both these men, and especially More, is he had a sense of merriment. He was merry when his house burned down, when the king put him in the tower, when the executioner was about to cut off his head. He had a sense of joy. And Dr. Wegemer is a great Thomas More scholar. And here's how he described it. So just listen. Wegemer says, "Yet he was merry to the end." Why? Because his good humor was not simply a matter of temperament. It was deeply theological, rooted in the cultivated virtues of a faith lived in the present moment, a hope that did not depend on appearances, and a charity rooted in eternity. That's pretty good.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good. So, Bob, let me say one other thing about the book, just so people understand how it's organized, because I did jump into your appendices, which are very helpful. but you've organized the book into 12 chapters on various topics. The first one is conscience. So did you want to say anything about the way you organized the book?
So yeah, so I'm a trial lawyer, become judge by profession. And what I learned in my work as a trial lawyer is that you can communicate significant truth through the telling of stories. And I'm also an Irishman, and so I love good stories. My wife claims that sometimes a good story, the facts don't get in the way of a good story when I tell them. But this was my idea of writing this book about these men, to use a lawyer's approach to both their life but also their prosecution, and to delve into their reactions to adversity and other things, and to come out with the story of their life in order to communicate these deeper truths. And so as you look at the choices they make in their lives, you become aware of the importance of conscience, the seriousness that they took, if they ever took an oath, their unwillingness to take an oath against their conscience. And ultimately, the story becomes a story about their deeply flawed prosecution by a corrupt parliament, a devious king, and ultimately their execution. They lived magnanimous lives, and they died as heroes of the faith because they had this belief in the Lord Jesus Christ and the utter conviction that their following him was their top priority. And so they could be excellent in their chosen vocations because they knew of their higher purpose.
So that is that in a nutshell what you hope this book would do for the reader, to help inspire them to understand they have this place in God's plan and to be faithful to their calling?
Yes, and so I'm 67 now, and I've seen the zigs and zags of professional life, and I've tried to make choices that were consistent with the gifts that God gave me and the opportunities that were before me. And one of the things I've learned over the course of a career doing that is it's much more important to pursue excellence in what you're doing in the moment, rather than to worry about what's going to happen next. I see in these men a pursuit of excellence that set them apart from their competitors in the law or in academia. But there was a peace and a serenity in the choices that they made, because they were making choices that honored God, and they were confident that he would carry them through the end. And so there's a lot of angst in the beginning of a career because you don't know what's ahead of you. But there's a recent song that says, I don't know what the day may bring, but I know who brought the day. And if we rest in the security of being followers of the one who brought the day, we can be successful and joyful in our pursuits each day.
Yeah, I tell my students sometimes that you can't write your life in prospect. You can write it, you can see it in retrospect, and the more faithful you are, you'll see threads coming together. Because a lot of times you're walking in the moment in a certain kind of darkness and just in trust. I mean, you don't exactly know what's going on, but you're trusting the Lord if you entrust yourself to the Lord. But particularly lawyers, they want to have everything figured out in advance, and that just doesn't happen.
They wouldn't call it faith if you knew what the result was going to be.
Right. So, Bob, let's take a couple questions here. Start taking questions. So, if you're listening, and you want to submit questions, feel free to do so again in the Q&A function or in the chat. So, first question is, can you explain the significance of More saying he was the king's servant and God's first, which is sometimes erroneously translated as but God's first?
So I think the best translation of what More said, the earliest translation was in a Paris newsletter where Cardinal Pole had written about the execution when he was safely away from England and outside of Henry's reaches. And in that description of what was done and what was said, he said, More said, "I die the king's servant and God's first." And I think the mistranslation of "but God's first" sets up a contradiction that doesn't exist, and More fully recognize that to be the king's good servant, he had to be God's first, and that was consistent and connected with an and, not inconsistent and disconnected with a but. So I think it takes some getting used to saying, but it fits so well that More said, "I die the king's good servant and God's first."
Here's another question. Some historians claim that Henry suffered brain damage as a result of a jousting injury, which explains his erratic behavior and brutality towards these men and others. Whether this is true or not, do you think Henry VIII was, quote, bad from the beginning, end quote, or turned rotten later in life?
I do think there's an arc of Henry's life towards evil. You know, in his early days as king, the Pope declared him the defender of the faith. King Henry defended the Catholic faith against the Reformation figures who were beginning to appear in England. Henry saw himself as a Catholic, I think, his entire life. But he increasingly became despotic. And I think part of that was that he didn't have the kind of disciplined internal life that especially John Fisher, but also Thomas More possessed. And so more and more over time, Henry became captive to his own lust, to his own desires. And as he went in that direction, he would brook no resistance. And so I do see it as an arc towards evil, not being intentionally that way in the beginning.
I mean, it's quite a tragedy, really, because, I mean, More was his teacher, right? And Fisher was his mother's confessor, and he was surrounded by these great saints.
There was great hope in the world of that day that King Henry VIII would be this Renaissance king who would lead the world away from war and into the new age of education and learning. And it was with great disillusion that he became something other than that.
Yeah. Here's another. If you could pick one virtue that is most admirable in Fisher and More, either the same for both or one virtue for each, what would it be?
You know, I don't know if this directly answers the question. I'll answer the question, then add something of my own, if you don't mind. So, you talked about Moore's prayer of detachment. His sense of detachment, to me, is profound. And then with Fisher, I would say that his disciplined interior life constantly rebukes my own laziness. That he was able to do what he did at the end because he prayed the office during the day. He was committed to his faith life in a way that made him live the way he did. My own addition would be with respect to Thomas More. More was an amazing family man, which is a great model for us today. He was the busiest man in England, but his family came first. He had 4 of his own children. He adopted a child from his second wife. He adopted a child from his second wife's maid. And so he had this family. He was probably the first homeschooler. He created an academy at his house, and when he wasn't there, he would hire Oxford and Cambridge tutors to teach his children. But he always taught faith and virtue first, academic excellence second. And so it's an extraordinary witness to us in the busy modern life that we lead, and an example of how that faithfulness to family paid off. He had this incredibly close friendship with his oldest daughter, Meg, and Meg learned from her father. And when her father was in prison, she wrote a prayer that she gave to him and said, I will pray this at this time of day. If you would pray it too, we can pray together, and we can pierce the bars and be spiritually one. And so what a great lesson a daughter learns from her father. And then when he is condemned and he's being led back to the cell, his daughter, being a woman, could not attend that trial. So she's waiting for him on the path going back to the prison cell. And when she sees him, she breaks through the guards and throws herself at him and begins kissing him. And it's the beauty of it is just astounding. And then Moore is in prison, and the last sentence he writes in his lifetime is to his daughter, saying, I never appreciated you more than when you ignored courtesy and demonstrated your love to your father. So this time that we spend training our children and pouring our lives and our faith into them comes back to us at the end of our lives in a beautiful way, as experienced by Thomas More.
Yeah, 2 great models for us, and a great book. By the way, it's got a forward, particularly for those of you in D.C. who know the great natural lawyer Hadley Arcus, a great forward by Hadley to the book. So, Bob, as we're moving towards the end here, I mean, you and I have talked about Moore and Fisher, for so many times, but I don't want to take up any of this time with my reflections. I mean, I've always been moved by Fisher as the one true bishop, and Moore, I guess, the one great public figure. But I mean, how about for us little people? I just think in Lent's the time to get to know these 2 people even better. But I turn it over to you for any thoughts you have, as we're wrapping up.
Yeah, I've enjoyed our our mutual love for these great men. And, you know, their greatness, they achieved more than any men of their day, but their greatness was not in their achievement. It was their submission to their creator. And they knew it, lived it, and now enjoy it. And so Lent is our preparation for Easter Sunday. You know, we go through the darkness of Good Friday to celebrate the resurrection of Easter Sunday as a prelude to what we will someday experience eternally with these great saints.
And we ask for their intercession for us too, huh?
Amen.
So we've concluding our time here. I thank everybody who listened. And this will be, unless we have some IHE staff online, I don't know if they want to come on and say anything, but this will be available online, and you can share it, and you can get a link so that your friends or family or others can learn about this book. Is there anything else that I, from the staff of the IHE, that I need to say to conclude this? Okay, I do want to thank Judge Robert Conrad, and I appreciate the effort here to help us get to know these two great saints in this time of Lent in particular. Thank you, Bob.
Thanks, Bill.
We are concluded. Thank you.